So I teach 7th grade humanities at Melrose Leadership Academy here in Oakland, and my inquiry focused on argumentation, so what makes a good argument. So the school I teach at is a K-3 and middle school. We're moving toward being a K-8 school, and I teach one class of 7th grade humanities, which is a combination of ELA and history. With 33 students. Most of my students are Latino, a quarter African American, and I have one student whose family is from Yemen. And their language backgrounds are really mixed. Most students are bilingual, English, Spanish, and have been redesignated. Some are still designated English learners, and then about a quarter are native English speakers and only speak English at home. So what I decided to focus on in the fall was argumentation. This was my first year teaching middle school humanities, and I realized that ELA and history, an overlap between the two is having to read lots of different texts and then use those texts as sources to make arguments that are original, so that are the kids' own arguments. And so these are some of the examples of the kinds of arguments they made from literature, what they might infer about a character. They studied products and decided whether they were fair trade, and then historical arguments about why, for example, why Islam spread so quickly. I chose, because my class is a much more diverse class than I've taught before, tried to choose kids that represented kind of a range of different language levels and literacy levels. So one of my students is designated as an English learner and came to Oakland in 4th grade, not yet literate in Spanish. According to the SRI, which is a reading test that students take in Oakland, she was a 2nd grade level reader in the winter, but I felt like this didn't really represent what she could do in class. And then I had KM, is this his initials, is a redesignated student who is at grade level and has what I call kind of good student behaviors. So he does his work, he always does his homework. But what I started to see in the fall was in his writing, it didn't seem like he was understanding, especially when he had to write about history. And I couldn't tell if he didn't understand the content that we were studying or he understood it, but he just had a hard time writing about it in a clear way. My third focal student was really similar. Also had those sort of good student behaviors, but when it was nonfiction writing, there was a lot of lack of clarity. And then my last student is also redesignated and really represents kind of the high range in my class. So I was an 11th grade level reader and really able to clearly write and speak about the content that we're learning. So to try to look closely at argumentation, I had to develop a new data source. So in Mill Scholars, we have what's called a routine data source, something that we can do with the kids often enough to get data like on a weekly basis. And my students write argumentative essays maybe once every month or every 2 months. So I created a new data source that I could collect every day to really track what they were doing. And those were adapting something that my school already did, which was meta logs. So every morning students do silent reading. And then they have 10 minutes to write about what they read. And it had been a reflective kind of writing, but I decided we need more regular practice with argumentation, so let's write argumentative paragraphs where they have to use whatever their SSR book is, in most cases a novel, as evidence for an argument. So an argument could be a prediction if it's based in evidence from the text. And then I also looked at the longer essays that we wrote. And most of what I learned this year is around understanding what actually an argument is. So it was really an opportunity for me to reflect on what is this thing that I'm teaching my students? Do I really understand what it is and what would make a good argument? So indicators that I decided would make a good argument based on what I saw in students' writing was, first, there had to be a clear argument. So I had to be able to tell what you were arguing. Then there was some evidence, and the evidence needed to be aligned with the argument. So your evidence needed to actually support what you were trying to argue and show comprehension of whatever text you're using as a source, and then also introducing it. So at the beginning of the year, students were sort of putting a quote kind of randomly in there, but with no setup. And then the third part was explaining the evidence. Sort of after you cite some evidence, what do you do with it to show that it really does support your argument? And so for each student, for each of my focal students, these were the sources that I looked at sort of once a month, and then I analyzed whether they met or partially met or didn't meet those 3 indicators. And I'm going to go through them kind of quickly just to see that the big pattern was that it was really hard for students to explain their evidence. So it was, at the beginning of the year, kids did have a clear argument, maybe a topic sentence in their paragraph, and they were trying to put evidence in there, but what to do with that evidence was much more challenging for them. And I realized there were sort of 3 demands of this task when I really thought, what is this task asking of students? First, they have to be clear about how that evidence does support their argument. So they have to be sort of clear in their mind. And then they have to translate that thinking into writing and be very explicit for an audience who isn't there. So that's where writing is really different from speaking. If I'm making an argument with someone, they're going to go back and forth with me and pull out my explanation. But when we write academic papers, it's all got to be in there. And that isn't always obvious to students that they need to do that. I also realized that we explain evidence differently depending on the kind of argument that we're writing. And so I had thought argumentation was this common overlapping thing. I'll just teach it in ELA, it'll transfer to history or vice versa. And I realized we really have to explain evidence differently for different kinds of arguments. And we use language differently. So different language structures might be helpful. So I'll show some examples of that. One kind of argument we wrote a few times in history were cause-effect arguments. So taking some historical event, like the spread of Islam, sort of what are the causes and what were the effects? So this was from a longer essay that a student wrote where she identified 3 different causes for the spread of Islam. And one of her body paragraphs is about trade. So another important reason for the rapid spread of Islam was the center of Islam was Mecca, an important trading place in Arabic or Arabia. So she's got some evidence here from a document about how traders would come, and then her explanation is they would have learned about Islam in Mecca, and they brought those teachings and beliefs back to their homes. Trading routes was important because, so the use of because, Islam was able to spread because they were close to Africa, Europe, and Asia. And then this evidence shows that without trading, they would not know about their religion. So the use of without trading, they wouldn't be able to do that. So particular kinds of frames that are helpful there. And then other arguments were more definitional. So we researched different products and we looked at standards for fair trade. And then they wrote essays deciding whether they were arguing for whether these products were fair trade or not. And so one student wrote an essay about a t-shirt company and in her introduction said what fair trade was based on these standards. And this is one of her body paragraphs about because it's of their low pay, they're not fair trade. So after her evidence, she uses sort of therefore, that means that they work many hours. So the sort of a rephrasing and then saying it's not fair. So then bringing in the term fair again. And then I thought about the kinds of arguments I was having kids write in these metalogs about their novels and realized they were really doing different things and different things kind of worked. So instead of trying to teach one frame, we're all going to do this, it was helpful to look at what the kids were doing. So in some cases, students would really clearly go back to the argument. So they would use the argument as a prediction. He's got a quote, and then this explains that, or we might use shows that. Therefore, he might be better than him, which was what his thesis was in the topic sentence. Other times when we do literary arguments, we really take a quote and unpack what that tells us, what we interpret about a character from it. So this was one about thinking a character is being judgmental. So then she pulls a quote out and then kind of interprets what she sees, what she infers from that quote. And then the last kind of argument that I saw students doing in literary arguments was taking an event and kind of evaluating it, whether this was good or bad for a character and why. And here a student evaluated the impact of one event on future events that happened in the story. So it was a story about basketball, and the kid was being kind of arrogant, and the coach made him play against him. And so she argues that was good because it benefited him in the long run. And so as I was learning about argumentation from looking at my students' work, I made several changes to my practice. One was just having a routine data source in the metalogs forced me to build in a lot more daily teaching of argumentation. So I built in a lot of mini lessons where we looked at models that I would write or that the kids would write. We wrote meta-logs together. We had a rubric that they used to assess their writing and assess their peers. And then we worked a lot on discussions. So how to have, working on discussions that would help us really develop an argument before we sat down to write. And this was really important in history because a lot of historical events are very complex, and the kids need to tease apart multiple reasons through discussion before they write. And then the last was toward the end of the year, thinking about the language structures that were useful for different ways to explain evidence, and then doing mini lessons on those as we were writing. And then in terms of next steps, where I would like to go in the future, or the questions that I have, are really how do discussions help kids with their writing? I think it's, we know that in language acquisition that students need opportunities to talk before they write, but really how does that work? And that requires really detailed data collection of recording discussions and following particular kids. How did they do in a discussion? What did they write? And for my students, we might have a debate, and then 3 days later, we actually write. So tracing that process, I would really like to look at that. Because I do see kids can defend their arguments and explain when it's back and forth, but they don't always see that they would need to do that in writing because it's different from speaking. And I also want to think about how to sort of try different strategies that would support kids move from discussion into writing. So capturing those ideas when they're really complex in a way that then kids have this when they write. So they're not starting, having to pull everything from their memory.